Imagine being just 11 years old, torn from your family, shackled in chains, and thrown into a world where you are no longer seen as human, but as cargo. This was the cruel beginning of Olaudah Equiano's life, a boy stolen from his home in West Africa and forced across the terrifying Middle Passage of the Atlantic slave trade. But this is not only a story of tragedy, it is a story of resilience, determination, and a fight for dignity against unimaginable odds. Equiano's journey took him from the brutal plantations of the Americas to the bustling ports of the Caribbean, and even into the service of the British Navy. Everywhere he went, he witnessed the harsh realities of slavery, yet he never lost the hope of freedom. Through sheer perseverance, Olaudah Equiano achieved what seemed impossible. He bought his own freedom. But he did not stop there. Instead, he turned his life into a weapon against slavery, writing an autobiography so powerful that it shook the conscience of the world and helped ignite the abolition movement. This is the incredible life of Olaudah Equiano, the slave who became a freedom fighter and whose voice still echoes across centuries. Stay with us as we uncover his remarkable story. The 18th century was an age of empire, trade, and exploration. But behind the glittering wealth of European nations lay a system of unimaginable cruelty: the transatlantic slave trade. Ships filled with sugar, cotton, tobacco, and rum flowed into ports across Britain, France, Spain, and Portugal. Yet behind these goods was the labor of millions of enslaved Africans, torn from their homes and forced into a life of suffering. At the height of the trade, between 1700 and 1800, more than 6 million Africans were captured and sold across the Atlantic. They were packed into ships under brutal conditions, chained together, stacked like cargo, deprived of air, food, and water. Disease and despair spread quickly, and many never survived the journey. Historians estimate that at least 15% of enslaved Africans died before even reaching the shores of the Americas. For European empires, slavery was not just a labor system. It was the backbone of their economic power. Plantations in the Caribbean and the Americas generated massive profits, enriching merchants, aristocrats, and even governments. Slavery was normalized, defended, and enforced by law. Africans were stripped of names, languages, and identities, transformed in the eyes of their captors into nothing more than property. Yet, within this world of oppression, voices of resistance and humanity emerged. Some rebelled with force, while others fought with words and testimony. Among them was Olaudah Equiano, a boy stolen from his village in West Africa, who endured the Middle Passage, slavery, and eventually freedom. His life story would become one of the most powerful weapons in the fight against slavery, exposing its brutality to the world. Equiano's journey begins in this dark context, a world built on chains, profit, and human suffering. To understand his story, we must first understand the system that tried to destroy him. Olaudah Equiano was born in 1745 in the region of modern-day Nigeria, among the Igbo people, one of West Africa's most vibrant and deeply rooted cultures. His village was small but full of life, a place of farming, traditions, music, and spiritual beliefs that shaped his earliest memories. As a child, Equiano lived in a community where family bonds were sacred. He spoke of the customs of his people, their dances, songs, and strong sense of identity. Like most children, he spent his days learning from his parents, playing with friends, and slowly preparing for adulthood. He later described his homeland as a place where people valued honesty, hospitality, and kinship. But this peaceful world was brutally shattered. When Equiano was just 11 years old, tragedy struck. While playing with his sister, raiders from a neighboring tribe attacked the village. In a matter of minutes, their childhood innocence was ripped away. Both children were seized, tied, and carried off into the terrifying world of the African slave trade. For days, young Olaudah was passed from captor to captor, sold and resold, marched across unfamiliar landscapes. He was separated from his sister, reunited briefly, only to be torn apart again, a cycle of hope and heartbreak that scarred him forever. These moments of family separation would become one of the most haunting themes of his later autobiography. Equiano vividly remembered the fear, confusion, and deep loneliness of those early days in captivity. Everything he had known, his parents, his language, his home, was gone. Each new household treated him differently. Some offered glimpses of kindness, others inflicted cruelty. Yet in every case, he was not seen as a child, but as a commodity, something to be traded. These months of captivity across Africa were only the beginning. After several transfers between traders, young Olaudah was marched to the coast. For the first time, he saw something that filled him with even greater fear than his captors: the vast Atlantic Ocean. And on its shores, waiting ominously, stood the slave ships, floating prisons that would carry him and countless others into a new and terrifying world. This was the end of Equiano's childhood, and the beginning of a journey that would test his very will to survive. As Olaudah Equiano reached the coast, he was confronted with a sight beyond imagination. Towering ships lined along the shore, bristling with sails and cannons. These were no ordinary vessels. They were slave ships, designed to carry human beings as cargo across the vast Atlantic Ocean. For a child who had never before seen the sea, the sight was terrifying. Equiano would later write in his autobiography of the overwhelming fear that gripped him. The ship seemed like a floating world, full of strange smells, strange languages, and strange people. He was thrust aboard with hundreds of other captives, each shackled and stripped of dignity. The journey that followed became known as the Middle Passage, one of history's darkest chapters. Captives were crammed into the hold of the ship, chained together in spaces so tight they could barely move. The stench of sweat, blood, and human waste was suffocating. Many could not endure it. Disease spread rapidly, and death was constant. Equiano remembered the cries of despair that filled the ship at night. He described the screams of women, the moans of the dying, and the anguish of children like himself, who could not understand why they were treated so cruelly. He himself became so ill that he nearly died, wishing for death as a release from suffering. But death was not always left to chance. Slave ship crews, fearing rebellion, used whips, chains, and brutal punishments to break the spirit of their captives. Some enslaved Africans, choosing resistance over submission, leapt into the ocean, preferring to drown rather than live in bondage. Equiano recalled seeing such desperate acts, each one seared into his memory. Yet, amidst the horror, his words also revealed resilience. Despite the cruelty, the enslaved found ways to resist. They sang in whispers, shared quiet prayers, and clung to memories of home. The bonds of shared suffering created a fragile sense of unity, even among strangers. After weeks, sometimes months, of unbearable conditions, the ship finally reached the New World. When Equiano and the surviving captives were brought on deck, they emerged blinded by the sun, scarred by chains, and forever changed. They had crossed an ocean, but what awaited them on the other side was not freedom, but a life of forced labor, exploitation, and cruelty. For Equiano, this passage was not just a physical journey. It was the death of his childhood, the destruction of his innocence, and the beginning of his lifelong struggle to regain control over his own destiny. When Olaudah Equiano stepped off the slave ship into the New World, he entered a reality as harsh as the ocean crossing itself. Like countless others, he was sold at auction, examined like livestock, prodded and priced. To his new owners, He was not a child with dreams and a family. He was simply property, a body with a market value. Equiano was passed through several hands before eventually coming under the ownership of a naval officer, Michael Pascal, in the British Royal Navy. This twist of fate would alter his path. Unlike many enslaved Africans condemned to brutal plantation labor, Equiano spent years aboard ships that traveled across the seas. Life in slavery remained harsh. He was constantly reminded of his status as less than human, always under the authority of others, always vulnerable to punishment or sale. Yet, in the service of the Navy, he also witnessed a world wider than he had ever imagined. He sailed to the Mediterranean, the Arctic, and even North America. For a boy torn from his homeland, these voyages opened his eyes to both the vastness of the world and the persistence of slavery across it. Aboard ship, he learned valuable skills. He mastered the English language, learned navigation, and gained knowledge of trade. But most importantly, he began to develop a sense of identity that went beyond being a slave. Still, his condition was never secure. At any moment, he could be beaten, sold, or discarded. He saw fellow Africans treated with cruelty, whipped, and humiliated. His friendships were often short-lived, broken by death or sale. Every kindness he received was overshadowed by the reality that his life was not his own. Equiano's years in slavery exposed him to both the brutality and contradictions of the system. He could serve faithfully in the British Navy, risking his life in battles. Yet he remained legally a slave. His humanity was acknowledged when convenient, denied when not. These experiences hardened his determination. He began to dream of a day when he would control his own destiny, when he would no longer be bought or sold. And slowly, through perseverance and careful planning, the foundations for his eventual freedom were being laid. Even in the harsh world of slavery, Olaudah Equiano discovered sources of hope that would guide his path to freedom. One of the most transformative was education. During his years of service under Michael Pascal and later other masters, he was exposed to sailors, traders, and missionaries who gave him glimpses of literacy. At first, he struggled with the strange symbols of the English alphabet, but slowly he began to recognize letters, then words, and finally sentences. To Equiano, reading was not merely a skill, it was power. The ability to understand contracts, to read the Bible, and to communicate beyond speech gave him a tool that most enslaved people were deliberately denied. Each new word he mastered chipped away at the walls that bound him. It opened his eyes to the wider world and gave him hope that his condition was not unchangeable. Alongside literacy, Equiano also encountered the teachings of Christianity. Missionaries and sailors introduced him to stories of redemption, freedom, and justice. He listened carefully, searching for meaning in verses about deliverance from bondage. Over time, the faith took root in his heart, not as a tool of submission, but as a source of strength. He saw in Christianity a God who valued his soul equally, regardless of race or status. This spiritual awakening helped him endure the daily humiliations of slavery. When he was beaten, insulted, or treated as property, he clung to the belief that God had not abandoned him. He began to imagine that his suffering might have a purpose, that he might one day use his story to help others. Education and faith together ignited a flame inside Equiano. He no longer saw himself solely as a victim of slavery, but as a man capable of change. With each passing year, his determination grew stronger. He began saving money from small opportunities. Trading, labor, and side tasks allowed him to earn modest sums. Though the road was long, Equiano believed that with faith, discipline, and perseverance, freedom was within reach. The boy who had once been dragged in chains across Africa was now envisioning a future he could shape for himself. The spark of hope had been lit, and it would carry him toward one of the most decisive moments of his life, the purchase of his own freedom. For years, Olaudah Equiano lived with one dream burning in his heart: freedom. No matter how far he traveled, no matter how many skills he gained, the shadow of slavery never left him. He was constantly reminded that he was property, that his life and labor belonged not to himself, but to another. Yet, unlike many enslaved people who had no chance of release, Equiano discovered a small window of possibility. In some parts of the British colonies, enslaved people were occasionally allowed to purchase their freedom if they could raise enough money. For most, this was an impossible task, but Equiano was determined to try. Through years of service at sea and in trade, he had learned how to make himself useful. He carried goods, helped with navigation, and even engaged in small-scale trading on the side with his master's permission. Bit by bit, he saved every coin he could. His autobiography recalls the countless sacrifices he made, refusing comforts, working harder than ever, all to gather the funds that could one day buy his release. Finally, after years of saving, Equiano had enough money to approach his master. With trembling hands and a heart filled with both fear and hope, he offered the sum in exchange for his liberty. The moment was tense. Would his master honor the deal, or cheat him as so many others had cheated slaves before? To his astonishment, the agreement was accepted. In 1766, Olaudah Equiano received his manumission papers, legal proof that he was no longer a slave, but a free man. He described the moment as one of overwhelming joy. I, who had been a slave in the morning, trembling at the will of another, was become my own master and completely free. Yet his freedom came with complicated emotions. He rejoiced in his new status, but he could not forget the millions of others still in chains. He carried with him the memories of the Middle Passage, the cries of children torn from their families, the countless faces lost to suffering. Equiano soon realized that his freedom was not the end of his journey, but the beginning of a larger mission. No longer bound by chains, he would dedicate his life to speaking for those who had none. His personal victory would transform into a fight for justice, a battle not just for himself, but for every enslaved African. The fight for freedom had been won for one man. Now, Equiano would take up a greater fight, the abolition of slavery itself. When Olaudah Equiano finally held the papers that confirmed his freedom, he might have chosen to live quietly, far from the horrors of slavery he had endured. But Equiano was not content to remain silent. He carried with him the memories of countless enslaved men, women, and children who had no chance to speak for themselves. He knew his story had power, and he was determined to use it. As a free man, Equiano traveled widely. He worked in trade, joined expeditions, and continued sailing across oceans. These journeys exposed him to more cultures and ideas, but they also reinforced a painful truth. Slavery was everywhere. From the Caribbean to the Americas, from Africa to Britain itself, the trade in human lives remained the backbone of global wealth. In the 1780s, a growing abolitionist movement was gaining strength in Britain. Activists, writers, and clergymen were speaking out against the slave trade, but many people still doubted or dismissed their claims. They said reports of cruelty were exaggerated. They claimed Africans were better off as slaves. What the movement lacked was a powerful first-hand testimony, a voice that could cut through the lies with undeniable truth. That voice was Olaudah Equiano. Encouraged by abolitionist allies, Equiano decided to publish his life story. In 1789, he released his autobiography, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vasa, the African. The book was groundbreaking. For the first time, European audiences could read the words of a man who had lived every stage of slavery, from capture in Africa to the Middle Passage to life in bondage, to the struggle for freedom, the narrative shocked its readers. Equiano described the horrors of the slave ships, the brutality of masters, and the deep scars of family separation. But he also revealed his resilience, his faith, and his triumph in gaining freedom. The honesty of his voice gave the abolitionist cause exactly what it needed: irrefutable human testimony. The book became a bestseller. It went through multiple editions, was translated into several languages, and was read by politicians, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens alike. Wherever it spread, it stirred emotions and challenged the conscience of a nation. Equiano himself became a prominent speaker. He toured Britain, addressing packed audiences. Listeners were captivated by his eloquence and authenticity. Unlike abstract arguments or political debates, Equiano's speeches were living proof of the cruelty of slavery. People could no longer claim ignorance. The truth stood before them in the form of a man who had survived it. His activism extended beyond speeches. He supported petitions, joined abolitionist societies, and worked alongside other famous campaigners like Granville Sharp and Thomas Clarkson. Together, they built a movement that would ultimately change the course of history. But Equiano's message was not fueled by anger alone. It was fueled by hope, the belief that human beings, once confronted with truth, could choose justice. His Christian faith gave him the conviction that slavery was not only a crime against humanity, but a sin against God. By the early 1790s, Olaudah Equiano had become one of the most recognizable black voices in Britain. His journey from a kidnapped child in Africa to an author and activist standing before members of parliament was nothing short of extraordinary. Equiano had turned his personal suffering into a weapon of change. He was no longer just a survivor of slavery. He had become one of its fiercest enemies. By the final years of his life, Olaudah Equiano had achieved what few enslaved Africans could even dream of: freedom, recognition, and influence on the highest levels of society. But his greatest legacy was not simply personal. It was the role he played in shaping the global movement to end the slave trade. His autobiography, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano, continued to circulate long after its first publication in 1789. It went through 9 editions during his lifetime, a rare achievement for any author of the period, and even more remarkable for a black man who had once been enslaved. The book became a cornerstone of the abolitionist campaign. Its vivid descriptions of capture, the Middle Passage, and the cruelty of slavery offered undeniable evidence that the trade was built on violence and suffering. Politicians who debated abolition in the British Parliament could no longer dismiss slavery as a distant, abstract issue. Equiano's words brought it home, forcing them to confront the humanity of the enslaved. His testimony influenced leaders like William Wilberforce, who would later lead the campaign for the abolition of the slave trade. Equiano also worked directly with abolitionist networks. He gave speeches, supported petitions, and used his fame to keep public attention on the cause. Though he passed away in 1797, just a decade before Britain officially abolished the slave trade in 1807, his writings and activism laid much of the groundwork. Beyond Britain, his story spread internationally. In America, where slavery was still entrenched, abolitionists circulated his narrative as proof of the horrors of bondage. In Europe, intellectuals praised his eloquence, comparing his book to the great works of the Enlightenment. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of Equiano was the example he set: a man who transformed suffering into strength and oppression into testimony. He showed that enslaved Africans were not voiceless victims. They were human beings, capable of thought and resilience and leadership. Today, historians see Equiano as one of the founding fathers of Black literature. His autobiography was among the first widely read books by an African author in the English language. It gave birth to a tradition of slave narratives that would continue through the 19th century, influencing writers such as Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs. Equiano's life also reminds us of the unfinished work of justice. Though slavery was legally abolished in many parts of the world, its echoes continue in modern forms of exploitation and inequality. His voice calls across centuries, urging us to remember, to reflect, and to act. When we speak of freedom today, Olaudah Equiano's story is part of that heritage. He proved that even in the darkest circumstances, one person's courage and determination can help change the course of history. More than 2 centuries have passed since Olaudah Equiano walked the streets of London as a free man and abolitionist. Yet his voice, preserved in the pages of his interesting narrative, still speaks with urgency today. His life was not only a testimony against slavery, but also a mirror held up to humanity, forcing us to ask what freedom, dignity, and justice truly mean. One of the most powerful lessons of Equiano's story is the value of resilience. Taken from his home as a child, stripped of family and identity, he endured horrors that might have broken anyone. Yet he refused to let slavery define the totality of his existence. His determination to learn, to save, and ultimately to fight back through words is a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit seeks light. Another lesson is the power of the written word and storytelling. At a time when enslaved people were silenced by law, Equiano's autobiography broke through barriers. His words forced society to confront truths it wanted to ignore. In this sense, his story proves that testimony, whether written, spoken, or remembered, can move hearts, change minds, and shape history. Equiano also teaches us about faith and moral conviction. His embrace of Christianity was not a passive acceptance of the religion used by many to justify slavery. Instead, he reinterpreted it as a source of strength and justice, a way to affirm the equal worth of all people. His faith gave him the courage to believe that his suffering was not meaningless and that he could help build a more just world. Finally, Equiano's life challenges us to see the continuities of oppression. While the transatlantic slave trade is long abolished, modern slavery and human trafficking still exist, affecting millions worldwide. The structures of racism, inequality, and exploitation that slavery helped build continue to shape societies. To honor Equiano's legacy is to recognize these injustices and to act against them. In remembering Olaudah Equiano, we are reminded that history is not only about the past, it is a compass for the present, guiding us toward the values of freedom and humanity that he fought so hard to defend. Olaudah Equiano's life began in freedom, was torn apart by slavery, and ended in a legacy that continues to echo across centuries. From a frightened boy kidnapped in West Africa to a young man enduring the horrors of the Middle Passage, from a slave serving others to a free man holding his destiny in his own hands. His journey was nothing less than extraordinary. But Equiano's story is more than biography. It is testimony. It reminds us that behind every statistic of the transatlantic slave trade were human beings with names, families, dreams, and voices. His willingness to share his pain and his triumph turned him into something larger than himself, a witness for millions who could not speak. His interesting narrative did not just describe slavery, it exposed its cruelty to the world. Readers who had once ignored the plight of Africans were forced to confront the humanity of those in bondage. His words influenced lawmakers, inspired activists, and helped dismantle one of history's most brutal systems. Equiano did not live to see the full abolition of slavery across the British Empire, but his contribution was undeniable. Without his courage to tell the truth, the movement for justice might have taken far longer to succeed. Today, his story endures not only as a record of suffering, but as a beacon of resilience. In a world where oppression still exists in new forms, Equiano's voice challenges us to resist injustice, to defend human dignity, and to believe that even one voice can make a difference. As we close this journey through his life, we are left with a simple truth. Olaudah Equiano was more than a survivor. He was a fighter, a storyteller, and a visionary whose impact crossed oceans and generations. His life proves that history's darkest chapters can still produce voices that light the way forward.